What's up, y'all? This is the Adventures in DevOps podcast. I'm your host, Will Button, and I have the co-host with the most, Warren Parad. What's up, Warren?
Hey, I liked how you had to look to the side to remember your name before introducing yourself.
Right, I'm so focused on remembering all the other stuff I have to do for the intro that, like, my own name is like, nope, brain's got no room for that.
Well,
page it back in. Page it back in.
Right. Yeah, I'm Warren. I'm the CTO at Authoress. I had to be careful when I'm talking at conferences because I'll often look at my computer, even if I have no reason to do that. I know what the words are that I have to say, but it's just so distracting to have something else there at the same time.
For sure. All right, joining us today in the studio, Tyson Trautmann, VP of Engineering over at Fauna, former GM from AWS Code Pipeline and Code Deploy, Senior Engineering Manager at Riot Games, and so on and so forth. What's going on, Tyson?
Hey, good morning. Super excited to be here.
Dude, I'm excited to have you here. It's kind of, we've had a theme going recently, not planned or intentional, but it definitely has turned into a theme where we've been talking in the last couple episodes about databases. And so you're going to talk with us today about the bottlenecks and challenges that developers have with databases. And one of the common things we've talked about in the last few episodes is how there used to be this career path called a DBA or database administrator, and that just seems to have mostly disappeared. So give us a little bit about your background and your thoughts on the state of the database today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll say DBAs are certainly still out there. They're still filling a very important function at a lot of different companies, including, back when I was leading the infrastructure platform group at Riot Games, we were kind of a SQL shop, had, a lot of DBAs as part of kind of the broader group, just managing our database instances. But definitely a trend that's changing for sure. Even like when I at that time at Riot, we were thinking very much about, moving towards automation, using things like declarative schema and some of the, things that I think we'll talk about here, bringing continuous delivery to the database, that kind of remove that need for a specific individual that's like, laser focused on the database, running scripts manually again on a specific database instance, like those types of things. It kind of gets into this, moving towards this, cattle not pets kind of mantra, that's kind of been more commonplace in other areas of software engineering.
For sure, yeah, because like when it comes to the world of pets, like databases were the most prized pet for a long time.
Still are a lot of places.
Yeah.
Speaking of pets, since we're live, by the way, mine may come bursting through the door at any minute here. I don't think they will.
Excellent.
That's right. Literal pets, not database pets.
Right on. That works. Yeah. So, I think that whole trend towards automation has made it a lot easier to interact with the database, especially. I know that ORMs are very contested and hotly debated, but I got to admit, like having something that generates roll forward and roll back statements for my database is kind of nice, even if I don't get the opportunity to specifically tune and test that query. Like for the most part, it tends to do the right thing in most cases for me.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, so there's no question that if you want to bring the best practices of continuous delivery to the database, there's a few specific pieces that you're going to need. And we've been spending a lot of time thinking about this and kind of how it applies to Fauna specifically. But more generally, like, one of the, what you're trying to do in the database when, to apply these practices of continuous delivery. I mean, first of all, when you make schema changes, you have to be able to validate those schema changes against your existing data, against services that call the database. And then you have to be able to replicate the transition process to make sure there's no issues getting from A to B. And you have to be able to do those things in all of your different environments, right? Ranging from kind of local development all the way to production. And so,
Right.
Will, the capabilities you were just talking about, which is, some kind of mechanism to go and programmatically apply schema changes is absolutely a critical requirement. There are others as well. We could get into that, but for sure, whether you're manually issuing queries, through an ORM to do things like manipulate data, maybe, potentially manipulate schema, or whether you're using something like, in Fauna terms, what we've recently launched is what we call the Fauna schema language, which is a declarative language for defining schema and getting to a known state. I'll put in a little plug. Declarative is typically where it's at for these types of applications, because there are a lot of ways when you're imperatively describing sort of infrastructure that you can get yourself in trouble, or you can get into kind of these little edge cases, and so there are some issues that you can run into there. But that's just a little plug.
Yeah, and so just to clarify there, by declarative, you mean you're just saying this is what I want the end state to be. Like, I don't really care about what happens in between as long as it ends up like this.
That's right, exactly. I want I want these database. I'll use Fauna terms, but I want these databases, these collections with this field level schema, and then even getting into more exotic concepts, like we support the notion of like user defined functions and check constraints, and all these other kind of cool things that you can that we could get into. But yeah, the ability to define that whole data model, the schema for that data model, and know that you're going to get into that state, without necessarily having to describe, like, here are 50 different transformation steps I'm going to run, and I hope that it all works out given the data in the database, and to get into that state.
For sure, yeah. Or learning the specific syntax or whatever variant of SQL your database platform happens to be using, and hoping that it either does it correctly or errors out, not something in between.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Cool. So it sounds like with Fauna, you're setting the stage for people to move, because I feel like there was this trend about a decade or so ago where we put all of the business logic in the code, like your constraints and your validations and things like that. Whenever prior to that, that was the role of the DBA, and databases have really powerful tools for managing that type of stuff quickly and efficiently. But it sounds like you're giving that control back to the database, but in a way that makes it easier for developers to leverage the things that databases do well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment for sure. I mean, we try not to be too prescriptive. Like, we want to meet developers where they are.
Right.
I think, but certainly bringing those capabilities to the database so that if you want, you can put some of that logic with your data. There are very powerful benefits that come with that too, right? Like, so for example, for modern kind of responsive applications, performance is a huge deal. So the ability to go and run a bunch of compute over your data, on the database, is potentially a game changer from a performance standpoint, versus like, doing a whole bunch of round trips and running that compute on the client, right? So
For sure.
having those capabilities available, and then also, another thing with being able to run that compute as part of a transaction on the database is even a next level kind of benefit once you get into these real operational use cases, right? So for sure, having those capabilities there so that folks can reach for them, if they want them when their application calls for it, is absolutely something that we're focused on.
Right on. So I think a lot of that is there's probably a pretty large educational component to that, because unless you have experience or a lot of background expertise in database servers, these are all things that you potentially didn't know database servers were capable of doing. So how has that shaped how you approach this problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, so what you said is true, although in some ways, there's the kind of, everything old is new again, right?
Right.
SQL's had stored procedures since the beginning of time. and I think there are different kinds of ebbs and flows in terms of, the kind of hot application architecture of the day. And, sometimes these trends, you look back and you say, hey, we didn't have it so wrong with some of these things that were going on previously. But for sure, I mean, yeah, one of the things that's been interesting about my journey at Fauna for sure is, you can build a really amazing product. And, as a consumer, I feel that, using the product, like there's no question that the database we're building is the database I would use if I left to start a company tomorrow. But you still have to tell that story to the market and help people understand what's compelling about it. And, this cool stuff that we're doing, you're doing kind of in a vacuum doesn't matter. What matters is how it maps to actual requirements of software developers and moves the needle, makes them more productive, makes their life easier, makes the applications that they're building, more secure, more available, more performant. And so, yeah, there's a big educational component. I mean, a lot of that is in docs. I think when you're building these types of apps, the quality of your docs is a huge deal.
Right.
Examples, all of those types of things are, big area of investment, no question.
I feel like you said something super controversial. So, and I don't know
Okay.
if I want to let you jump over that.
All right.
What is old is new again. I feel like there's a whole swath of engineers out there, orgs and companies who would swear by the stored procedures have always been wrong and will always be wrong into the future.
Sure.
I'm curious, I don't think there's a particularly right answer here, but maybe there's like some sort of spectrum, and this is what belongs at the database layer, and this is what belongs more at the domain or business logic outside in your application. Any thoughts? Where is that line that actually needs to be drawn?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I think I try to stay away from some of the kind of more, zealoty kind of religious debates like that. Again, to me, I think, Warren, it really comes down to the use case and what you're trying to do, what the requirements of your application are.
Yeah, for sure.
But, and we could get into kind of specific examples there. But I think one of the problems with stored procedures in the past is it was this entirely separate code, application code that sat kind of outside your app.
Yeah.
And it was, it had a separate life cycle from your application.
Yeah.
So there was no, single life cycle in terms of continuous delivery and how you get that application to production. You had to think about things like versioning between client and server. And so a big part of what we've been focused on, with our recent launches with Fauna schema language, et cetera, is solving that problem by putting that logic together. So, the typical pattern when you're using FSL to describe, your data is that code lives in your repo with your application code. It's versioned together. This is what we do internally. We have a heavy dependency on Fauna. We eat our own dog food, drink our own champagne, however you want to put it. And that's certainly kind of the best practice that we follow as well. Everything rides together. So I think, part of the answer is it depends on the application and the specific requirements of the application. But another part of it is the problems that people had at that point in time can be solved through better products and better tooling around those products as well.
No, I'm totally with you. I remember a non-trivial number of times writing some giant framework to manage getting storage procedures written in your Git repository into MS SQL at the time, and making sure they were executed in the right order, intertwined with whatever schema changes you also had. And then there's no way to really live validate that without running it for real and making sure that it fits some arbitrary query plan so that it's optimized, or even that it's using real fields. Dive in, coupled types just aren't there in most databases when you think about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. You nailed it. And that's why, to me, what good looks like here is, again, you need the declarative tools where you can, in any environment, so in Fauna terms, you could spin up an instance of Fauna locally in our Docker container. And you can use FSL to apply schema there. So you can use this for even local integration testing. But so you have the ability to apply declarative schema. It works in any environment. And then you have, tools to load data as well, because like we mentioned earlier, you need to validate schema changes against existing data. And we do that through, we have two mechanisms there, a backup and restore, backup and copy tool in the live environment. And then we also have a data import tool where you can sort of play arbitrary data to load that into a database. But then, you start wiring this thing up in automation as part of your CD pipeline, and all of a sudden these tests are running locally, again, against a Docker container or something, or against the live service if you prefer. In your integration environments where you're seeing the actual consuming services under potentially real world load, with those schema changes, with the new version of your UDF or your stored procedure as that's going to production. And then, you can even safely apply those changes using that same tooling all the way out in production, again, which is what we do. So super powerful concepts.
So I'm going to ask a really dumb question and hope that the listeners of the podcast who might actually have the same question can appreciate the fact that I'm taking one for the team here. Is Fauna its own database engine, or is it something that sits on top of other database engines?
It's its own database engine. It
Okay.
is it's a net new novel database that was built, effectively kind of from the ground up. It was deeply inspired by there's an interesting research paper that came out of Yale years ago by Daniel Abadi, who's an advisor at Fauna, and a few others, that was kind of an interesting spin on how to run distributed transactions in a very different model than like the typical kind of two-phase commit model that Spanner and other like truly distributed databases use. So that's kind of at the heart of Fauna. That's what we call our distributed transaction engine. It's a big component of Fauna. It handles multi-region replication with the strongest possible level of consistency guarantee. So that's kind of the secret sauce, in the core, the guts of the product. Again, we don't like, sort of abstract nerdery. We like to tie back to real world application requirements. But the reason that matters is, number one, people want multi-region replication for performance. If I can do fast reads from the local region, that's a really big deal for a lot of modern applications.
Right.
It's also the best possible DR story. If you literally have multiple regions running in an active configuration, we see examples where our good friend US East 1 is having issues, and we don't even know it.
Say it isn't so.
Just keep cruising right along. But then, doing all that with strong consistency is really the huge deal, because as developers, it's very expensive to reason about these different edge cases that you can hit in your application code, right? And to me, that's a bit like people talk about, we have a strong-ish level of consistency guarantee. Well, I either have to reason about these funky edge cases that I can get into, or I don't, right? And with Fauna, you don't. So that's kind of the guts of it. When you talk database engine, that's kind of the some of the secret sauce and innovation that we've been focused on.
That's cool. So it almost sounds like rethinking the database based on considerations that are relevant now, but weren't whenever most of our common database platforms were created.
Yeah, I think for sure the considerations that weren't relevant when folks were running, single instance, Postgres instances, or
right.
Primary, secondary type configurations that are really still there, with some of the bigger players that folks are using today. For some apps, that's fine. That's, there's some applications where, you're not going to hit this insane scale where you're going to suddenly have to start thinking about partitioning. And then you got to start thinking about, I was using Postgres because of the strong transaction support, but now I can't do or cross partition transactions. How do I solve that? And, there's a ton of interesting innovation there. I don't want to put they're like very cool tools for specific kinds of jobs, but, for applications where scale and potentially multi-region replication are a strong requirement right out the gate, I think Fauna is in pretty unique air, up there with a few other offerings that are really kind of ground up. Like, let's think about how to do distributed transactions, in a first class way. That's a hard thing you can't just take that and bolt it on.
You brought up documentation before, and I feel like there's a direct link here. Actually, something on my mind a lot is I feel like Authoress has done something similar in the security domain, and the novel aspects that we've added to hopefully remove the confusion from users, sometimes get in their own way. Like they have expectations that a database requires a commit transaction step that replicating across regions with some sort of replication agent like is there by design. And some of the more experienced engineers get caught up with expecting those things to be in place. Do you see that a similar problem exists for Fauna?
You know, I think people are usually, if you build it, I think we built it in a way that feels pretty intuitive, because with Fauna, so with traditional databases, whether that's, let's say, a SQL-based database or that's something like Mongo, your transaction model is kind of tightly coupled to the session, right? And so that's to your point, Warren, that's like that's the mental model. It's what you're used to. You have to do things like session management, et cetera. With Fauna, you're just sending us HTTP requests, basically. An HTTP request essentially contains some code that you run as part of a transaction. And so I guess my experience there in this particular domain, it sounds a little bit different, is it's the way we've implemented is pretty intuitive. So folks get there and they're like, hey, this is cool. I don't have to, I don't have to think about these things like session management. I don't have to think about, is this code running in the context of a transaction? When do I, effectively commit that transaction? It's just, I'm sending a transaction, I'm getting a response back, and I can do that in the shape that my application expects it. And that feels pretty intuitive. That's, I think, has been my experience, watching folks when they first pick up the product.
No, the reason I ask is because there was a lifetime ago, there was an instance where I was working with an engineer on GCP's Firebase, and there's a bunch of promises that Firebase makes with instantaneous commits, don't have to worry about concurrency or anything like that. And it's that really felt counterintuitive, that these databases that are on opposite sides of the world won't have any sort of race condition. And I guess that's not like the way you've designed Fauna is much more seamless than that it makes it obvious when there is going to be potentially a problem and when there's not, and no one has to worry about anything.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, like there's no free lunch in engineering, right? So we try to promise something that doesn't, and the trade-off that you're making, when you're doing things like effectively running this type of active configuration where you have multi-region replication with strong consistency, like you can't cheat the speed of light. So there are performance trade-offs to that. What we've done is try to optimize to that frontier of what's possible, so that you're pushing, if you're doing writes through the transaction pipeline in the US in Fauna, you're talking mid double-digit milliseconds, right, of replication time, and reads can be served from the local region, so very fast, like low single-digit milliseconds. And in practice, that trade-off is very attractive for most applications, especially when you can avoid these like multi-round trip, like multi-transaction scenarios where you have application code running on the client. Like it's not, but I just want to be clear, like there's always going to be, you mentioned the Firestore case, for sure, if for whatever reason you think your application is fine with eventual consistency, that's a different model, and you can achieve a different performance profile. Where warranted. I'd say buyer beware, because a lot of times you think your application's okay, eventual consistency is an acceptable model for your app, and then you end up finding out it's not. So, but yeah, just want to be honest there.
No, it makes a lot of sense, really.
So you said that interacting with Fauna is HTTP API. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we've done a lot of interesting work. I don't know if we want to go there, but we've done a lot of. There's a lot of innovation in Fauna, kind of in how we route to the database as well, which has been a super interesting set of challenges. Typically, I think it's kind of an afterthought for a lot of database providers, but thinking about, the point, because we're so performance focused, thinking about that trip from the application to the database as well is something that we've focused on quite a bit.
Right on. Yeah, that makes sense, because using that pattern you end up getting a lot of being able to take advantage of a lot of work that other people are doing in that same space instead of reinventing that work.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Stacking on top of HTTP is so much easier than TCP packets, or quick, or even if you're going to implement your own quick communication protocol.
Yeah, no question.
I actually took a look at Fauna before this. I was curious, and I'm looking at that, and then I'm looking back at the cloud providers, and I'm wondering, like, when is it going to be that one of the cloud providers offers me a database that actually achieves as much as these external providers get? And I just see such a huge discrepancy, and I just, I'm surprised that they haven't made a lot of progress in this area.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I'll say, like, effectively all of the kind of hyperscalers are, fantastic partners. Today we're in the AWS marketplace, we're in the GCP marketplace, we'll be in Azure down the road as well. And, Fauna by definition, we have our, what we call our public region groups. We call it region group because we replicate data across regions by default. But you can also deploy something called virtual private Fauna, which is still serverless, but single tenant, like VM level isolation, and you can pick your cloud providers and your footprint. So pretty cool offering for like larger enterprises that need more isolation. But yeah, I think the reality is, like, those large providers, if I take my former employer, AWS, I'm saying this as somebody who's no longer with AWS, but they have very successful offerings, DynamoDB, RDS, et cetera, that are out there. And those things have a lot of inertia, and they continue to do work to make those things better. But those are multi-billion-dollar businesses, in and of themselves, and so it gets harder to go and compete with a startup in a weird way there, because you don't have any competing interests at a startup. Like, we're just setting out to try to build the best possible database for modern application developers. Whereas I think at some of those, we've all. Anyone who's operated in the context of a larger, company, once you have those revenue streams, there are different kind of goals, and you have to cater to that existing audience, right? Mongo, which is a fantastic product, obviously, it's been around for a long time, been very successful, still growing leaps and bounds. They can't throw out the on-prem business, right? You can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so you have these kind of existing businesses that are very successful, a great thing for those enterprises that they have to serve and focus on. But I think, to your point, I think it makes it a little bit harder to go and build something that's kind of a generational leap, right? That's significantly better for application developers. But in fairness, we do see that there's a lot of hunger from those companies to go and partner, and they want to drive the best outcome for their customers. And if that ends up being, we have a close running conversation with the Lambda team at AWS, for example, because there's a lot of synergy between Fauna and Lambda, where the data's at the edge, where you can run your Lambda functions. You don't have to maintain sessions, which is fantastic from those kind of ephemeral environments that can just go away. So yeah, they're good partners for us. And like I said, we're right there in their marketplace, so you can buy us alongside the first party offerings that are there as well.
It sounds like a bunch of innovators' dilemma, but also innovation is coming if you pick the right providers.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely believe that.
What kind of design changes or design approaches require a mental shift to take on something like Fauna, where you've got a serverless database with your data sitting on the edge?
In terms of, so when you say design shift, you mean from the consuming application?
Yeah, like if you're architecting an application, are there any considerations that are there things that you may make it down the road and say, oh wow, if I'd done this, I would have been a lot happier?
Yeah, good question. Just thinking, there are kind of these very modern application architectures that Fauna, in a way, is sort of uniquely suited to serve, but you don't have to be using one of those architectures for to take advantage of a database like Fauna or some of these other like very modern databases. We have plenty of customers that are running a more traditional application architecture where they have like a single region app server, sitting in, pick a region that's accessing Fauna, and they're not necessarily taking advantage of multi-region replication, other than the fact that it's there as part of a DR story. So they could fail over, if their app's in region, but if their app was up for some reason and, some service dependency brought us down in a region, that traffic could fail over and route to another region. But I think the answer is, like, we work just fine with those types of like, more traditional architectures. Or if you're some new startup that's very forward thinking, you're building something greenfield and, you want to take advantage of all these new awesome offerings, run compute out at the edge. You can do that, and Fauna pairs very nicely with those types of architectures as well, right? Because we're going to have your data there, serverless. You don't need to think about scaling, managing instances, et cetera, those types of concerns. So I don't think there, I can't think of any specific gotchas or something that you should have in mind as you adopt these kind of modern databases. I think they, roll pretty well into the existing paradigm, but then as you get towards these newer architectures, they can really shine.
So
Gotcha.
if someone spent the last 20 years building MS SQL and now has shifted to RDS, there's not like, it still sort of works pretty much the same if they were to switch to Fauna, other than get all the benefits. And there's not a lot of potential pitfalls with this sort of different database engines that are out there today.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, the downside is you have to go and you're going to have to migrate application.
Yeah, for sure. And your data.
And your data. Yeah. I mean, you may have to. I mean, we have some tools that do. You can export, import data, do some different things. I think we'll continue to get better there. Hasn't been very top of stack focus for us. We've been kind of more focused on innovating the core product. But yeah, for sure. No, I think if you're if you bite the bullet on that migration, there's a whole bunch of benefits that come with it for sure. I mean, we have existing customers that have come from, you name it. I'd say recently, more of the focus for folks that are coming to Fauna are people who jumped from relational databases to document databases because they believe in the document model. They're not a fan of ORMs. They don't like this document, relational impedance mismatch. But then all of a sudden, they're running on Mongo, Firestore, whatever, Dynamo, Cosmos DB, and they miss some of the relational capabilities they had with their relational database. They're not ready to give up document, but they want these relational capabilities. Fauna fundamentally is what we call document relational. It's this kind of new paradigm where we store data as documents on disk. But it has the capabilities that you typically expect from a relational database. So for example, the ability to define first-class relationships across documents and kind of and access those documents in the ways that you would expect with a relational database. So so there's a lot of excitement from those folks that see this as like, all right, kind of the best of both worlds. I've jumped in the document model, but I get all these capabilities that were the good part of my Postgres database.
And it's not like a ParseQL on top of DynamoDB.
That's
right.
That's right. Yeah.
Cool. So one of the big challenges, I think, with a lot of larger databases is you always end up in this situation where you're doing ETL. It's pretty common to ETL your data out for analytics. How did y'all approach that?
Yeah, we've got a few options there. Like first of all, we support, so there's a Fauna Airbyte connector that some of our customers use. Airbyte open source product, they have a managed offering. So you can use Airbyte to, the connectors they have to, to pump data from Fauna to your analytical database of choice. We also support streaming, so you can stream changes to documents or sets in Fauna. So different mental model, Airbyte is kind of the more traditional, like I want to push like batch updates to my analytical database. Streaming is more commonly used for these kind of, responsive apps where you want to push changes to a client or something. But we do have some customers that for these different use cases actually want to leverage streaming to push changes to sets to a different database. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of the most common patterns. I'd say it's not there today, but we're thinking a lot about. I felt like one of the buzzwords at reInvent this year was like zero ETL. Amazon was announcing zero ETL for all of this database and this database, which really my mental model, like you're still doing ETL. It's really, I think it's more just kind of like managed ETL. These kind of higher level connectors between databases where more of that is managed just behind the scenes and it just works. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to necessarily bring in a third vendor or manage something yourself. And so that's something that we're thinking a lot about now, is what that would look like, to create these kind of more managed ETL connections to some cloud providers. Nothing there, it's in product today, but something it's certainly on our radar screen.
Like we're talking about streaming to, say, BigQuery or Redshift, something like that, or to Snowflake, for instance, without the customer needing to do anything extra.
That's right. What if you could just do some kind of an off handshake to that provider and, maybe give us a little bit of metadata about, I guess you're getting into describing transforms. There's, same sets of defaults where things just work, right? Like that's, I think, this, I'll say, like, Amazon went way down the path of this, like a specific database for every possible scenario.
Yeah.
And then quickly realized, well, that creates a big headache when you're thinking about moving data around. And so they have these different offerings like Glue and other things to, to move data between services. But I think there's a lot of folks that aren't content with that situation. And what they want is to say, like, hey, yeah, you got us in this situation. Now help me move data around more seamlessly without, I don't want teams of engineers that are just doing undifferentiated heavy lifting, building tools to move data from A to B. Yeah, I think that's part of what created this problem that's now resulting in like zero ETL. I'll say, by the way, too, like we're more bullish on innovation at the database layer that can unlock a more generally suitable database, right? So Fauna, we even see people starting to push the bounds where they're issuing, what traditionally looks more like analytical queries on top of Fauna. Now, we're not optimized for those use cases, but, I'll say new databases like Fauna are very powerful. And I think, we're getting away to some extent from that mold of like, oh, I need 7 different databases for all these specific use cases. And I have to think about replicating data between them. I have to think about keeping data in sync, et cetera.
Oh, for sure. So rather than ETLing the data at all, just build the database so that it can meet those needs in the same platform.
Yeah. Depending, I mean, again, I don't want to get back to, used car salesman here. I'm not saying that there are architectural trade-offs you make when you build a database that will make them more suited for a specific set of use cases. But it's very clear that customers don't want a whole, database portfolio, right? And you see this you see this going the other way too. I mean, you see, Snowflake, for example, launched their Unistore offering where they sort of try to bolt the transaction pipeline onto your analytical database. I haven't played with it. I've heard, there are performance issues, things like that, et cetera. But for some people, it's compelling. If you're right there, your primary workloads are analytical, you need transactions for some specific use cases, that can be compelling. And so I think there are, we're certainly not the only ones. There are a lot of vendors thinking about this, how do I bring more functionality potentially into fewer offerings to make life easier for customers.
No, I think that's super important because at least historically with Snowflake, I haven't looked at it recently, to be honest, getting the data in was sort of a challenge. So it offering more functionality doesn't necessarily change that. The zero ETL connection on the actual database application side is super, like really valuable.
Yeah, I agree.
I guess you could say databases aren't Pokemon. You don't have to collect them all.
True. Agree with that.
I really got to get the applause plug-in working on this because otherwise it's just awkward.
I didn't. I should have brought my snare drum and my crash. I could have given it. It's downstairs though, so we can't make that happen.
See, I mean, I feel like there's a duality there though, because the more sort of fundamental engine aspects that a database engine offers, it has to be trading off something, right? Like either you have to pay more because the data has to be replicated very quickly to a different format, or you pay some sort of latency on processing in order so that it can actually figure out what the optimal execution is. Like we have this, so we primarily use DynamoDB a lot, but we also have some graph needs. And I still haven't found a good, like, I love it graph database for us to sort of bet on. And I'm not sure that's something that Fauna does, but a lot of them don't do that. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the question is, there's going to be, the frontier that you can get to, right, in terms of how much you can do based on the architectural decisions that you've made.
For sure.
But the question is, can you get 80% of the way there in the same database, where for specific use cases it's good enough? I mean, you mentioned graphs, so it's an interesting example we could dive into. Fauna is not Neo4j, right? Like we don't have a first-class concept of edges between sort of documents or entities in our database. You could model that in documents, and Fauna, because we support this ref field type, where you can effectively, denormalize as part of a query across documents, these relational capabilities we're talking about, you can model a lot of these graph use cases, and people do this, right? Like we have an interesting customer that's using kind of relationships that you would think about as more of a graph type use case to fetch related entities to go and inject into an LLM as part of an AI app, right? Like, so there are things you can do there. Now are we made a different set of architectural decisions than Neo4j. So are we ever going to be as good for the P99, P100 graph use case? No, that's not our goal. But if your data is already in Fauna, and if you like our capabilities as just a general purpose operational database, and then all of a sudden you have these graph use cases, are the requirements that P99, P100 use case where you need to go and ETL data into a purpose-built database? For some people, the answer will be yes, and that's totally cool. We want to support those use cases, have convenient tools available. But for a lot of folks, the answer is no. And if we have the right set of capabilities, we can unlock those use cases for them, without adding the management overhead of kind of another offering.
That's a really good point. And I just want to set the record straight. We don't use Java for our stuff. But no, I mean, there's some joke here about for sure the Pareto curve, that you can make it look like it. And I even feel like the graph databases are much too slow for the usage of graph that most people have, right? Like even if it is relationship based, you probably can achieve a much faster result, say using Fauna, than pulling out the P100 graph database solution and putting your data in that. It's just usually not as fast in most cases.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely true.
So Warren, question over to you. What was the deciding factors that pushed you to choosing Dynamo for your data?
I feel like this comes up a lot, and primarily, I think the sort of data that we're saving is sort of relationship aspect, but we store the roles and identities for individual users and the permissions that are associated with them, and that lends itself a lot to a key value store. There is a relationship aspect there, but as I said, it is sort of like this 80-20 principle where most of the data does not benefit from being highly relational. There's also ease of usage. Something that came up previously, and I want to ask Tyson here, is like, when do you hire a DBA? Like for whatever words you associate with the acronym DBA, when do you hire one? Like we don't have one. I don't want to get into the business of having to get one. I don't think it scales for us. And so things like DynamoDB, Fauna, these NoSQL or pseudo NoSQL document stores that offer key value aspects, I feel like have a much lower complexity, a much lower barrier to entry for application engineers than say trying to spin up an RDS, which also doesn't replicate well. DynamoDB offers global tables. We offer global solutions as a global company, and having multi-regions that are active configurations is like a huge importance for us. Yeah.
I'll say, so there's a few interesting ways to go there. First off, on the Dynamo one, because I thought this was a fun question to chase down a little bit. You're absolutely right. Like Dynamo is a great tool for super fast KV access, predictable latency. Even at several nines, you're still getting very predictable latency. Yeah. It's interesting because having been at Amazon, where most apps internally now are being built on Dynamo, there's this almost religion to it where you're saying, again, we can't build a performant enough, scalable enough, general purpose database. So we have to fall back to a tool like Dynamo. It's effectively, at the end of the day, KV access, and then build a lot of complex application logic to go and support that, right? Because we have kind of a lesser consistency model. limited access patterns. You mentioned global tables for multi-region replication, but when you go to global tables, there's a lot of gotchas. I mean, they're expensive, eventual consistency, again, even more limited in terms of access patterns and what you can do. And so, for sure, I think, Dynamo is an amazing tool for what it is for those specific use cases. But we see a lot of interest from customers that they want that predictable KV access, which other tools like Fauna provide. But then, they don't want to have to think about transactions in their application code. They don't want to have to think about, they want to support very flexible access patterns where a lot of times, in Dynamo, even kind of the adopted mantra of Dynamo, things like single table design, you really have to, which has been all over Twitter lately, you really have to understand your access patterns up front. And so maybe, you come up with your data model, and things work fine for that initial use case, but then you go to build the next feature and you're like, oh crap, I'm screwed. It's not going to support this. So there are a lot of gotchas there. I think great service for what it is, for sure. I can say firsthand as somebody that used to run AWS services, they're always going to get a lot of uplift because they're integrated with IAM, CloudWatch, CloudTrail. They're right there in the ecosystem. But I do think it's worth, for a lot of folks that are just diving in, taking a peek at some of the more modern offerings that are out there, like Fauna, and say, because not only are they going to work for that initial use case, even if it's just KV storage, providing super low latency, KV, but they're going to scale to those access patterns without requiring you to kind of understand all those access patterns up front. So that's my little spiel. Warren, you'd gone into a separate question, which is about hiring DBAs. I don't know, we could go ahead.
I mean, you mentioned a lot of really interesting things there. I think that what I'll say is we definitely have a bimodal distribution where it's very easy with things like DynamoDB for a very simple app to get up and running without the complexity. And then there's this lull in the middle where you don't want to be in. And we're at the point on the other side where we sort of fundamentally know how DynamoDB works as though we implemented it at the service level, because we know where the edge cases are and we're figuring out how to get around them or understand how partitioning even works because we're at that scale. And we have tons of application code that wraps it to make it as effective as possible. So yeah, I mean, at the second mode, long tail, you for sure, if you're using DynamoDB at scale, you will know how it works for real, and you will have lots of application code to deal with that.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, for sure. And then once you're in that state, we talked to a lot of companies that are there. So we built up expertise. We have a lot of application code around it. It's working. There's for sure pain. But the question is, when does that pain get too high? We talked to a company it was a big Dynamo customer, and it was taking them literally, I think, days to build, new GSIs. They're running in GSI limits, et cetera. And so they were at the point where they were, it was okay, this is literally no longer tenable. We have to explore other options because it's not working for our use case, but that's pretty extreme, and there are a lot of companies that are in the state that you're in where Dynamo is working great. It's a very powerful tool. They've built up internal expertise and they've built this layer of their application on top of that. That's necessary, for their specific use case. And that may be fine. That's could be the right spot for them to be in. I guess my point was more around, there's a lot of people that dive in because they're there in the AWS ecosystem. It's a convenient tool, without necessarily understanding that they're going to have to go and do what you guys did, which is a lot of application, or a lot of investment around the database to make it work for your specific use case.
Yeah.
And you may not need to do that. If there may be kind of other more modern databases out there that might handle some of that, what I'd consider to be more undifferentiated heavy lifting for some use cases, not for all use cases, on your behalf. So that was more what I was pushing.
Yeah, totally agree.
I do want to dig into the DBA thing, though. What do you think the role of the DBA is moving forward? From here moving forward, do you think it still exists? Is there a particular place where it makes sense?
Yeah, I think, so DBA as traditionally understood, which is a human, thinking about pets on a kind of a very one-off basis, thinking about database instances, that will exist, for a while, just essentially to service these kind of legacy applications that are written on top of, single instance MySQL, Postgres, whatever, SQL Server instances that will be around again. Will be around for a long time. So there will be demand for that. But I think looking forward, I think what you're going to see is, software engineers with, some domain expertise in terms of data and data modeling, because that's a big field, and nobody can be, a software engineer with general expertise across every area. But you're going to see software engineers with that kind of expertise, who are helping enterprises at scale to think about their data architecture, and how data is consumed across, a complex SOA or whatever that architecture looks like, right? But they're going to be doing it in scalable ways. They're going to be taking advantage of things like, the Fauna capabilities that I referenced earlier, where it's going to feel more like writing application code traditionally has. They'll be using all these practices like, what we call schema as code, more similar to infrastructure as code. It'll be bringing that cattle, not pets kind of mindset to the database. So that there's going to be more and more of a need for folks in that kind of role, which looks more like, software engineer with some expertise in data and data modeling.
You're integrating with the database layer than you are figuring out how to optimize one. I mean, obviously, I think that's a great answer. I mean, the cloud providers or the Faunas of the world, right? If you want to be a DBA, maybe that's where you go, right? To these products that are offering this primarily at scale, so that companies don't have to think about what their engineers are going to have to know in order to put data in a database somewhere.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, but the people that we're hiring, it's hard to go and recruit for these roles, but folks with deep database SME that are actually going to get in and think about, improving performance of sort of the transaction pipeline, the storage engine, for sure. I mean, there's a limited pool of people that have spent time solving those challenges in the real world. They're very highly sought after. And we would rather hire those people, so that you don't have to think about those kinds of hard challenges, for sure, is the way that we think about it. Like, we want to take as much of that sort of complexity as reasonably possible and solve those challenges in a common way, so that, more and more, the primary goal of what we're doing is trying to allow these application development teams to go and innovate and focus on their application, and not, not do this, undifferentiated heavy lifting. I mean, one of the things I saw in a past life when I was at leading the code pipeline and code deploy teams at Amazon, it was interesting because, at that time we were competing. We had built an interesting offering at kind of a lower layer than kind of the GitHubs and the GitLabs of the world, with, things like actions that were launched. And that was compelling for like the P100 of enterprises that wanted to go and innovate at that layer. Warren, kind of like what you were talking about on top of Dynamo, right? Where it actually matters, and you need to go and do this, build these specific release capabilities in your application. But the bulk of people were coming to us and they're saying, hey, make this really easy. Make it easier for me to release safely like Amazon does, but for my enterprise, without me having to staff an internal team of 8 people, to build this layer on top of, say, code pipeline or whatever the tool, Jenkins, whatever the tools that they're using. I heard that repeatedly from every enterprise that we talked to. And you can think about what we're doing in some ways as kind of analog in the the database layer, different domain.
I like it. You drew a parallel between code pipeline and Jenkins, because those are at the same level for me.
They're different for sure, but we could go down a whole rabbit hole there for sure. But I'll say, like, the common thing is, when I was leading the infrastructure group at Riot, we had innovated a lot on top of Jenkins for reasons. So I guess the parallel is that, those lower level, less opinionated offerings that are very powerful, but in practice, you end up needing to staff, a team or a group of people to think about how to take that and apply it to your specific domain. And you end up building these layers, on top or in your application to handle, to take that and integrate it into your use case. That's the common thread I was trying to pull on.
I'm totally with you there. Actually, it was my job at a previous instance to actually migrate the organization to start using Git, and along with that was turn off Jenkins and actually start using GitLab at the time. And there was a whole number of challenges with that, but for sure, no one was going to do that work if it required building on top of the equivalent of code pipeline.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll say in fairness, I think Amazon, it's interesting, internally, I think Amazon spends more time thinking about things like release safety than any company on the planet. I feel fairly confident saying that. And, Code Pipeline had some interesting capabilities inspired by that internal learning that I think made it the best offering. If you were a large enterprise with unique release requirements, meaning you need to release across regions, and you need to think about, let's say, 4+9s of availability, et cetera. I think we had optimized in some ways for those sets of capabilities, more so than just like, convenience. I mean, it's the typical developer that's using GitHub Actions, for example. It's totally fine to spin up containers to run, release pipelines that actually have no knowledge of other executions in the pipeline, because they're only releasing once at a time and maybe once a day, or whatever. There's not this complex sequencing. And so we were thinking about those kinds of use cases, that are super interesting, but more relevant to the P100 of release automation. And again, getting back to the kind of no free lunch theme, you make trade-offs to do that, and ease of use is one of the babies that gets sacrificed sometimes as part of those trade-offs.
No, I think you're absolutely right there.
I think that highlights one of the needs of using managed providers. Like, as a managed provider, I'm looking not just for management of the infrastructure, but also like some guidance on how to effectively use the product.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You
I
totally know that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there's sort of tiers to what you mean in managed. I mean, this is true of serverless too, right? Like, people use the term serverless to describe just about everything these days. It's become a little bit whitewashed. We say all the time that we see APIs as kind of the highest possible layer of serverless, because literally, it's request response, specified input output, and you're not thinking about any of those lower level concerns. What you're getting to is an interesting point, which is you can even go higher than that, which is, thinking about things like documentation, instruction, learning, all those things as sort of part of that core offering as well, that take the abstraction up even higher, which I think is a good point.
Yeah, to use I think I used this quote in last week's episode too, from Jurassic Park. You spend so much time thinking about if you could, you never stop to think if you should. And I think that's one of the opportunities managed providers have, is to answer that or provide some insight into whether or not you should be taking this approach.
Yeah. When you said Jurassic, I'm a little disappointed when you said Jurassic Park. I thought you were going to go Samuel L. Jackson and say, "Hold on to your butts," or something like that. Did you say that on the podcast? I don't know. Rebooting the servers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a limited number of Samuel L. Jackson quotes you can use on the podcast.
Fair. Well, we've at least
I'm a big fan of all of them, but there's only a few of them we can know.
Where do we go
Awesome.
from there?
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on an hour here. So how about a quick summary on who the ideal user of Fauna is and what they can expect by trying out the service?
Yeah. I mean, really, I'd say the ideal, Fauna user is someone who's building modern applications that store operational data, right? I think that's pretty general. I mean, we see there are certainly specific verticals where we see more adoption, so we can talk about those. But it's a pretty generally applicable product for these different transactional workloads. Particularly if you applications that have very high performance requirements, responsive applications, et cetera. Applications that have high availability and security requirements, because we manage things for you. typically we're going to be more available than if you go and try to manage your own database. I think those are a few areas where we really shine.
Right on. When you say high performance, you talking like NASDAQ level high performance? Would you go that high?
Yeah, I mean, we have folks that have built different financial kind of like cryptocurrency, for example. We have folks that have built like trading applications.
Right on.
Streaming data using our event streaming. But again, the main focus there is that because the way that we do multi-region replication and the way that we have that data there, and even the optimizations we've done at the routing layer, we can just get you to that data very quickly to do things, to make decisions based on that data or to render that data. So yeah, it's low, latency sensitive applications.
I mean,
Nice.
Will, from the knowledge that I have about this, a lot of the order books are usually tried to be saved in memory anyway. So you persisting them to a database, I mean, you could pick anything. It seems like Fauna would be just as good a choice as anything else, whatever makes sense for the actual application.
I got you. Right on. Yeah. Cool. Well, before we move on to picks, Tyson, if people want to learn more about you, interact with you, find out more about Fauna, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, for Fauna, I mean, fauna.com, reach out to us,
Fair
interact
enough.
with us on social media, email, drop me a line, whatever. I guess I'm less interesting, but I'm around. I tweet very occasionally about mostly work stuff. I'm not much of a social media guy. But yeah, I'm around on the platform, so feel free to drop me a line.
All right, awesome. Let's do some picks. Warren, want to kick us off?
He always likes picking on me to go first. So
right, FNG.
That's really why he needed another host in here, so that start the time. Yeah. So mine's going to be something from my personal life. I know that as a DevOps advocate, optimization is such a huge part of what we do, and especially automation as well, but optimization primarily. And so this is about picking socks. I have to say that if you're someone that loses some socks every once in a while to the washing machine or dryer monster, just the next time you're out and you need some more socks, just get like 20 pairs of whatever it is. You'll never have to think about it again. And when you lose one of them, you won't even know. And it won't even matter from that. Get a hole, doesn't matter, just throw it away. So especially favorite socks, I got to say, just absolutely fantastic, has changed my life.
Right on. It's a great point.
I'm pretty boring on my socks, Warren. I'm like order the same kind in bulk from Amazon, and every time they start getting a little shabby, I chuck them out and go.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the thing to do. I tried doing it with shoes one time. That was a mistake. I would not recommend buying more than one of the same kind of shoe. But they also deteriorate over time. So if you really do like something you've got and you know it's going to get worn out in the future, get multiple extra pairs.
Right on. Fair advice. Tyson, what you got for a pick?
Well, I'm told I can go pretty broad here. I'm gonna.
Yeah, for sure.
This is a bit out there, but I'm a wine guy.
Okay.
My biggest hobby when I'm not making software, we actually make a bit of wine. There's something I think very rewarding when your day job is thinking about software and something that's intangible, from like putting a bunch of work in and making something that you pour into a glass and enjoy at the end of the day. So my pick, I'm going to give a shout out. I live in the state of Washington. There's some pretty amazing wine being made up here. And so if you want to try some good Washington wine, I'll give a shout out to a friend of mine who makes wine at a winery called Vapiano, which is over in Walla Walla. It does a great Cab and a great Syrah. So if you're looking to experiment with some really good Washington wine, you can go and check them out.
Right on. Awesome. Cool. For me, my pick, I live on the edge of the country, and so I go for long runs out in the countryside pretty often. And there's a lot of people who have dogs out there and no fences and no leashes. And most of the time the dogs are cool, but occasionally you get some dogs that are pretty territorial. And so I recently picked up the ViperTech heavy duty stun gun. And the thing is just so cool because, like I'm going to try to avoid, becoming the target of the dog's aggression. And if a dog does come after me, I don't want to hurt it. But, at the same time, don't want to get hurt either. And so I did a lot of research, and a few people suggested stun guns, a taser. Number one, because you can just click it and the noise is enough to deter most dogs. But then if it escalates, you've got the ability to tase them as well. And so, yeah, I picked up the ViperTech, just ordered it on Amazon, and it's pretty cool. Haven't actually used it yet. Haven't had to use it yet, other than just, seeing a few dogs, and sure enough, you click it and they're like, yeah, okay, we're done. So
how heavy is it?
Pretty effective.
How heavy is it to bring that around?
It's super light. Like carrying it in my hand doesn't even register.
Got it. Cool.
So yeah, I was worried about that, worried about carrying it and having it just become cumbersome, but it hasn't been by any means.
Got it.
So there you go. Got socks whining and a stun gun from today's episode. What could go wrong?
Put all these things together.
Right. Awesome. Well, Tyson, thanks for joining us. It's been super insightful and pretty entertaining, so appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Cool. Right on. Warren, thanks for joining me once again. Thanks for holding up the co-host role and showing up. Appreciate it. And to all the listeners, thank you all for listening, and we will see y'all next week.